Right. At the development department, we believe that fundraising works better with a plan. And one of the basic questions we get asked, well, what's in a development plan? So, Tom and I thought we would take a minute to break down what we think are the seven major components of a development plan, right? So, Tom, let's start with the landscape analysis. What is it and why do you need it?
No one is working in isolation. So it would be a rare day in which you are the only nonprofit doing the type of work that you are trying to provide the community. So we want to understand who are the other players in the market. We want to understand how do you fit into the social fabric of your community? What are this is, an easy SWOT analysis might be a methodology that you could use. What are the strengths and weaknesses of your unique effort? But then also what are the opportunities and threats in your community as you're thinking about we're going to raise money in order to drive our mission. But again, we need an context under in what parts of the community and what are the specific needs and who else are we in competition with for resources.
I think, in addition to what's happening outside of the organization, you also need to talk about what's happening inside of the organization. What's going on with your donor base? How engaged are they? What kind of retention rate do you have? What about staff and board and volunteers? Do you have enough people to carry out the work? Do you really need to get more additional support? And do you have the right systems and tools in place? If you're doing something that's very mail heavy or very email heavy, do you have the right programs? Do you have a good CRM that is keeping track of your donors and your engagements with them? So you want to be looking in that landscape analysis, both what's happening outside of the organization and what's happening inside of the organization. And then going from there, go into your goals and targets, which we all are very familiar with. We want to make sure that we know how much money we need to raise. What are we being expected to? But there are also some components of that for the different targets. What kinds of things do we typically see in a development plan?
Yeah. One, I don't take for granted that everyone knows what their fundraising goal is. So we're going to
Mm.
start there by what is the fundraising goal and why? We often overlook the why. So instead of just saying a number, because our board says we need to raise $1 million, great. Okay. So then how are we going to get there? So one is making sure that everyone in the organization is aware of what the private revenue goal is or what the fundraising goal is and where are those elements coming from. Then it's breaking down into specific strategies. What's realistic based off of where you are currently and what investments you would need to make over the next period of years in order to grow the revenue for each of those different revenue streams. So that section is not likely to be the shortest. It might sound like it's simple, but you actually need to invest some time to really understand we need $1 million so that we can and start to provide a value proposition, not only for yourself internally, but that is going to be then be key in your communication and messaging to donors about why you need the money in the first place. So
Right.
that's a key section.
I would also say that, while we are always advocating for raising general operating dollars so you can place them wherever it's needed, you still need to know if there are specific programs or departments that have a requirement in order to do the work. So if the organization needs to raise $5 million, but you have a department that is going to require 3 million to operate, it's extremely important for you to know that, even if you are not segmenting all of the funds. But what you also don't want to do is be in a position where you raise more segmented dollars. Thank you, restricted. I couldn't think of the word. When you raise more restricted dollars than the program actually needs, because then you have money you can't use, and nobody wants to be in that position. So you definitely want to know what your fundraising targets are by department or program area as well.
Yeah,
All right.
100%. 100%. So again, there's a lot more that goes into what is our development budget or what is the fundraising goal and targets because the oftentimes it sounds like it's a simple answer and that can become the crux of a lot of disconnect and confusion when you're starting to build out the rest of the plan. Right. What else do we need?
Well, this is the fun one, and this actually is the longest section, or should be the longest section in your development plan, and that is the strategies you're going to use to raise that funds. So you want to be breaking that out by area because all areas are not created equally, and all areas do not require the same things. So, first, I think probably the most common one is the annual fund. Some people refer to that as individual giving. That often takes a lot of time, generally raises about 20% of your organization's dollars. That will vary from organization to organization, but it is a lot of people giving fewer dollars. And so you always want to keep that in mind about where you're spending your time. And then the one that I think is probably one of the most important ones is major gifts, making sure that you know who your major gifts givers are, what you're doing to cultivate them. You really ought to be talking relationship strategy. I know, Tom, you have 6 to 7 contacts with a major donor every year.
6, 7. For anyone
Up
who's in
to
middle
six,
school or
seven.
has a middle schooler, I didn't want to miss the opportunity. You just set me up for that. Yeah,
I did, and it was not intentional at all.
at minimum, you want 6, 7. Now you'll remember that. You want 6 or 7 individual touch points with a major gift. Really, all of your donors, but specifically your major gift to make sure that they are informed about the impact that they're making. They feel that they are appreciated and that we are expressing our gratitude on a frequency that is more than just once a year when the check comes in. And they need to, have an understanding that you think of them holistically as a person, not just a check writer. Some of those it's not enough just to send them a monthly newsletter, right? That is not the advice that we would give. Instead, how would you take the time to get to know what ReGina's unique interests are? So, for example, I would send ReGina, hey, I saw this great recipe and it made me think of you. Now, on the surface, be like, what? That had nothing to do with the work. And it's like, yes, that's the point. The point is that ReGina now knows that Tom recalled something about her that was unique to her outside of her relationship with the organization. So that can be a really intentional touch point because then my next reach out is like, hey, I hope you tried that recipe. Was there any luck? Oh, and I want to make sure that you saw the invitation to the event. So now I can connect that back to a more holistic relationship. So we spend a lot of time talk about this in the development plan, but we also specialize in coaching to help think through what some of those strategies might be. So,
Right. And
Virginia, you did a
you're
great
going to
job.
hear us talk about I was gonna say, you're gonna hear us talk about relationships, 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 relationships. It's so important.
Yeah. And so you did a great job talking about the individual buckets. So individuals and families from annual fund and major gifts. Other areas which people often bucket into one category, and we will encourage you to break, is grants, the G word, grants. And so this is a mix of both corporate and institutional grant making. Well, and those are separate. So, what are the motivators for a corporate prospect? Generally, are driven by three elements, which is visibility for their brand, employee engagement, and the community impact that your organization is providing. So, you need to be designing your grants to resonate with that audience, specifically in whichever order those three drivers are motivating their decision making. So, corporate grants have a different approach versus an institutional funder who might be a private family foundation or just a private foundation that is less interested in the employee engagement piece and is really focused on what is your bottom line in community deliverables. So, that community impact piece. But you've got to know, am I looking in the right places? If I'm submitting a proposal to an organization who has stated that they don't fund anything related to the work that our organization is doing, you're frankly wasting your time and their time by spending time on a proposal that is not going to land because of their grant making priorities. So we talk through those nuances. And then, of course, government grants. And government grants come with a completely different approach. There's generally a lot more compliance on the back end. So before you commit to taking the dollars from a government entity, you'd also want to make sure that you have the capacity to maintain the reporting cadence and the compliance with that grant. So we will talk through all of those when we're going through a plan. Some of you, especially in this environment, have a lot of government funds coming in, and you're now starting to question whether or not those dollars are as reliable as they may have been in the past. So we want to look at what is the breakdown of revenue streams by source to ensure that you're not setting yourself up to be overly reliant on one source of revenue in case there's a disruption in the system. Other areas outside of that include events. Are you a membership organization or do you have an alumni base that is paying dues? Go back to individuals for a second. What is your planned giving? Everyone should have a planned giving ask. Everyone should know what planned giving means. If you don't, give us a call. Other things that are really important right now, especially as we're thinking about the volatility of other revenue streams that have been heavily relied upon, or are earned revenue. What are the opportunities in your organization to exchange value with someone for their investment? And so it is okay to have trainings or seminars or information that you're relaying to an audience that they're paying for because of the service that they render. A nonprofit can, in fact, generate income from their expertise and their knowledge. It is not a charitable deduction in the same way for those individuals because they're receiving a good or service in exchange for those dollars, but that can be a really important and often overlooked area for nonprofits to make money to drive their mission work. And then investments, for those of you who are able to put money into savings for a rainy day fund. We can talk about endowments into the future. And so there's a lot of different components that we should be thinking about when building the various revenue strategies. I just talked a lot, Regina. What I missed? That was a
Well,
lot.
no, you covered it all. I think it's really important, and one of the things we also do is talk about diversifying your revenue streams. It's extremely important right now, particularly at this time when the funding landscape is not as stable as it has been. But it is also important to evaluate your various funding streams to determine, is the juice worth the squeeze? Talked to quite a few people who had events, and they were lovely events. They were so lovely. But if you're netting 10%, 15% from the event, and it's taking up 6 months worth of time for the organization, the juice is not worth the squeeze. So it's also looking at all of these areas and how much money you're predicting them coming in, and really putting your resources where it's going to be maximized. So we help you do that, and you should be doing that in your development plans as well. All right.
I
So,
want to go down a rabbit hole around events. And so I'm restraining myself, but that would be a good conversation for you and I to have at another date because there's an over reliance on events as a revenue source. And oftentimes they're not looking at the actual cost to execute that event, which is in fact inclusive of
staff time,
staff time.
staff
And
time,
so you might think you're
staff
generating a lot of
time.
revenue, but you're not. And so you have to evaluate the ROIs. Plug for a future episode when we will dig deep into events. And for the record, I see value in them. And I've had some
Yes.
success pulling off some really fantastic events. But you've got to understand that that has to be a smaller part of the overall picture than what you might currently be budgeting.
Well,
All
and
right,
you also
Regina.
need to be really clear about what the purpose of the event is. If the purpose of the event is to bring in exposure, if it is to bring in new potential donors, if it is to build relationships with the community, that's different than raising money. And you have to take all of those things into consideration. But yes, Tom and I could talk events probably all day. So we will definitely put that in for a future episode. To the development plan, after you've done your revenue strategies, you really also want to be looking at your board. You need to have a board that is engaged and a part of the fundraising plan. Now, all boards are not created equally, and we do have some organizations that have working boards as opposed to fundraising boards. Fundraising boards, they know they're charged with raising money for the organization, and that's why they've been brought in. Working boards, on the other hand, oftentimes are actually sort of carrying the water along with the staff, if there even is a staff. So they may not be as accustomed to it, but it doesn't mean that they're not part of the fundraising plan. So that can be things as calling donors to say thank you, going on calls with the executive director, writing notes to people, identifying people that they can talk to about the organization and raise money. So you need to be looking very specifically at the board you have and how you can get them engaged in fundraising.
Yeah. To simplify that is it is a section in and of itself because it deserves to have a spotlight shine on it. So
Hmm.
need to have a plan to engage your board. We will work with you to figure out the exact way and approach to right size that for your organization, but it's a non-negotiable.
Absolutely.
All right. So the next thing we talk about is the communication plan. So this is thinking through how are we effectively communicating with our current supporters and our future supporters about the work that we're doing. And whether this is run within your department or led by a separate team, the development department has to be aware and in sync with the overall communication strategy of the organization. I've worked in an organization where it was separate, but more often than not, it is in and of, especially in small shops, you're wearing multiple hats. And Regina and I can attest that we have lived that experience. We empathize and sympathize with that unique tension between I need to share the story, but I also need to generate the revenue and bring new supporters in. So that is why this is its own section within the development plan is to think through how are we communicating, what are the various marketing channels that we're using, and what is the purpose of each communication. So not unlike what we were talking about with the events earlier, is this just to raise brand awareness, or is this a strategy just to tell our story so that people are aware of our impact, or is this a lead generation where we're trying to capture new attention and bring them in, and if so, what are the strategies that we're deploying for someone to engage with a social media post and then bring them closer to the work to ultimately convert them into an actual donor. So there's a lot that can be put into that plan, and social media can be an element, but it's also similar to the event theme, which I am going to move off of, Virginia. I swear. We're not going to talk about
I
events
don't
today.
believe you.
But for social media, like you have to have it, but you also can't be overly reliant on social media as a strategy to tell your story. So if I was going to make a parallel to another revenue source, it's you can't make social media be your overinvest in it in a way that it is distracting you from your ability to build genuine relationships with those who are already supporting your work.
Social media is not you. Let's be very clear. And there isn't a substitute for you. There isn't a substitute for going out, talking with donors, meeting with people, and introducing them to the organization. I think also, though, with communication strategy, you need to be plugged in to what else is happening in the organization. So if, we did a back to school campaign, programmatically, we were talking about backpacks and getting kids ready for school. For a fundraising level, we did the same thing. Well, let's lead up with that. So we need to provide for these backpacks. We want to make sure that all of our kids get a good start. So we're raising money for that, or we're raising money to start teachers off with the school year well, right? But we want to make sure that what's happening in the organization, as much as possible, is synchronized with your fundraising messages so that all of the communication that's going out at that time is thematically linked, that is supporting one another, that it all coming together, and it seems like you actually work for the same organization. So, if you really want to be if the communications department is not part of the development department, you wanna be besties, you really wanna be very closely tied so that that aligns. And speaking of which, that takes us to the next thing, which is a timeline. I love a good timeline. But you want to lay out when you're doing all of the things. You need to talk about how often you're making major donor visits or major donor calls, the big event, when it's happening, and how much time, because you can't have a major event, a major programmatic event happening, and it be in the middle of an advocacy season when people are going to be in Tallahassee talking with representatives. You want to make sure that you thought through when all of your campaigns are happening, when people are receiving messages. You need to know those 6 or 7 times donors are receiving messages, because you also don't want all 6 times to happen in January and February of the year, and they don't hear from you for the rest of the year.
Yeah. Yeah, we have previously talked about burnout and some of the strain that is uniquely felt by development teams, and some of this comes into we always talk about the euphemism. It's busy season. It's busy season. And so we then justify why everything is happening in the month of October. And you're like, why did we do this to ourselves? And that's because we didn't slow down to build a plan to avoid. We shouldn't also do our major event at the same time that we're doing this big stewardship thing. Also, we're doing this, as you just said, Regina. So hopefully, this also provides some clarity across the organization when there's quote unquote a busy season. How can we right size that to maximize its value? And some of that is going to be unavoidable, right? There are only 12 months out of the year, and nonprofits are trying to do 15 months of work every single year. Like, we get it. At the same time, how do you ensure that you spread the work out so that there's some consistency, not only for the capacity internally, but for the experience of your stakeholders? So, timeline, I would arguably call it a work plan as well. So, timeline, when you said you love timelines, I immediately was like, moving along chronologically. And it is that, but it is also a little bit more detailed to talk through how do we avoid overscheduling ourselves at the risk of not being able to maintain the deep relationships that ultimately this is the main goal. And
Right,
then
and avoiding the competition, right? You don't want to be doing things right in the middle of holiday season. We are located in Florida. A lot of our clients are in Florida, and for major donors, a lot of them vacation elsewhere in the summer because it's too hot. So you can't have a major donor event in the middle of July. You're going to have two people be able to attend. Also thinking through conflicts, other things that are happening in the city. We have to avoid major football games and those kinds of things as well. So, really strategically thinking about when you can have your events, your engagements, your relationship building, your touch points in a way that makes sense and is still going to maximize your time.
right.
All right.
Meanwhile, I'm
And
coming
then
to you from Pittsburgh, and I don't have the same worry about the weather the summer. For us, it's winter. So we have to take into account this goes back to the landscape analysis. And while that might sound like something you overlook, is what are the patterns of the community in which you are working and playing and living? Because you need to follow donor behavior. If many of the northerners are snowbirding in Florida during the winter, then I need to have that into account. If I'm trying to pull off a big event in January or February, I need to know that some of the audience that I'm trying to reach isn't going to be available because they're enjoying the Sunshine State. So, yeah, again, I think there's a lot that you can put into that section under timeline. And then lastly, Regina, let's talk about evaluation. Why do we need to have a whole section related to evaluation in our development plans?
well, it's funny because in grants, this is consistently the worst section for grant applications. It is the weakest. People don't think through it. For development plans, it is the same. So outside, we raised this amount of money, we didn't. How are you going to know if you hit your targets? If you don't have a way to track your evaluations, because you might hit your targets, but it was some very strange anomaly. So the plan still doesn't actually support this fundraising goal. You may also not hit your targets, but there was this major change in the market that you need to be aware of, and you need to plan for that in subsequent years. You need to know what's working and what's not. You may have an event that is tremendous and another one that's not producing. You may have certain kinds of engagement. People really love supporting this program. They're not really understanding what this one is. You need to know how you need to adjust as fundraisers and as an organization to know that you're in a position to deliver the work that your organization is committed to. The only way you're going to do that is an evaluation, and it has to be done on the front end. Evaluations work best when you think about them on the front end, not when you try to backload it at the end, like, oh, we got to make sure we hit what we said we were going to hit.
Yep. We need that baseline. We need to understand from where are you starting and from what are you building upon so that you can realistically hit the targets that are being set in the previous section around fundraising goals and targets, right? So we will work with you to identify what are those key performance indicators that you should be monitoring, on what cadence you should be monitoring those, and how are we setting targets that recognize that there's always a room for improvement, continuous learning. If your donor retention rate is at 35%, we know that that is below the national benchmark. So we are going to be working with you to identify where are you investing in donor stewardship to, at minimum, increase that by 10 points to bring that up to the national market rates, right? So that will also help inform the strategy. It's both a baseline of why we're recommending the certain strategies listed previously in the development plan, but then also these are the things you should be keeping an eye on, because once you start to see these different behavior shifts within your stakeholder community, you want to be ready to then potentially unlock and pivot to the next strategy, right? So I do agree with you, ReGina. Oftentimes there's an overemphasis and an over reliance on just the big number, that we are not looking at the health of the fundraising apparatus because we're not looking at all the other components. So, what is the return on investment from any one of our revenue programs? We should all be talking about that. And that should be a healthy conversation. So, I keep smiling because I'm thinking of all the stories you and I could tell, but if someone's coming in, wouldn't it be great if we took this example that this other nonprofit just successfully used to raise money for them and just did it over here? It'll raise us millions of dollars. I guarantee you have heard something to that effect. And it's usually coming well intended and innocently from a board member or the executive director. So there's some positional power at play. And you're like, yeah, let's look into whether or not we should do the ice bucket challenge. Like, it was a once in a lifetime. It was a very unique phenomena, and it had its time and its place. And I'm very excited for that organization to have raised the money it did. But we can't just take it and try to replicate it for our audience. And if we did, and we evaluated it, you would know definitively that that strategy had its time and place. And even though we invested the time and went out and bought 75 5-gallon buckets and sent those out to all of our top donors to dump water on themselves, and only 3 of them did it, you would be able to talk about why that may or may not have worked. You're laughing because you and I know we've had these situations.
We've had these experiences. So we are really, really extremely understanding of some of the things that you might be facing. And another thing that I often hear is, yeah, this is great. I don't have time to do this, because it does take time. You have to sort of stop and really think through it. I will say, I think it is critical that you have a development plan. It really just sets the tone, and it sets the expectations for everyone of what needs to happen. Now, one of the nice things about working with us is that you can keep doing what you're doing and we will stop everything and write the plan for you. But it is important to have one, and you can have that for the year, 2 years, 18 months. I wouldn't really go beyond a 3-year plan. I actually think 18 months, 2 years is about right. But we have the ability to stop and really analyze things with that objective perspective while you keep working, and really devise a plan that is still tailored to your organization, that does not include an ice bucket challenge or, whatever the latest trend in fundraising is, but something that really is sustainable, that makes sense for who you are and what you're doing and what is happening in your community.
Thank you all for joining us today. We have many stories to tell, and I just keep smirking because I'm thinking about all the fun things we could talk about. But hopefully you now see the value of development plan, and there are other sections that might be relevant that we would add to your plan. So please be in touch with us. Reach out. We have our website, the development, dept.com, the development department with the abbreviation for department. ReGina and I would love to start a conversation with you to explore how we can support you reach your potential and to drive your mission's impact. Remember, fundraising always works better with a plan.